This is a Parsha podcast brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study, and I'm your host, Yosefa Fogel-Rubel. Let's learn. Welcome back to our Breishit series, These Are Our Heroes, where we're exploring with our guests a central figure from each Parsha, asking them what's meaningful, inspiring, powerful, challenging, and thought-provoking about their behaviors. This week's episode has been sponsored by Barbara and Joel Rich in memory of Barbara's father's Yortzeit, Reuven ben Eliezer Yonatan. For those of you who love listening weekly, sponsoring an episode is a wonderful way to show your gratitude for the high-level content we try and put out each week. For more information, contact me at podcast@matan.org.il or the Matan office. I just want to say on a personal note that we have sponsorships for almost the entire book of Breishit, and it's really meaningful. It's meaningful to hear from everybody. It's meaningful to feel like this is a platform that you feel is worth utilizing for the memory and thinking about your loved ones. So really appreciative of that, and thank you to all of you who have reached out. Parshat Chayei Sara opens with the monumental purchase of Ma'arat HaMachpelah, the cave of the patriarchs, from the people of Chet, which conveys both the responsibility of burying one's dead and the importance of it being on one's own soil, what the Torah calls an achuzat kever. The majority of the Parsha concerns itself with the search for Yitzchak's wife by the servant of Avram. Resolved to marry his son to women from within the extended family, he goes out in search for a shidduch, and this is the way that Rivka enters the family. The Parsha ends by filling in the rest of Avram's family life, his children, with his wife Keturah. The Parsha's final section recounts the children of Ishmael in what is the book of Breishit's consistent way of exiting a character off stage once and for all. It will do the same with Esav's numerous descendants. Today, I'm happy to welcome back Rabbanit Rachel Weber Leshaw to the podcast. She has been on the podcast several times before. Rachel teaches Talmud and Jewish law at Or Torah Stone's Midrash at Lindenbaum and functions as the Yotzat Halacha and is also my chavruta.
Thanks for having me.
So Rachel, we're going to change our usual topic of conversation from halacha chavruta and go today into conversation about the Parsha and specifically about the figure of Rivka.
I'm really excited to talk about Rivka because even just in the car on the way here, I was thinking about how perfectly literarily the Torah sets up the introduction of Rivka. The beginning of the Parsha, Sara as it exits stage right, and then it becomes clear that we need a new main character, somebody else to step in, and so a search begins. Avraham wants to make sure that, Yitzchak has a son, right? The only thing Avraham is missing is seeing grandchildren. And so he sends his servant off to find someone. It actually reminded me a teensy bit of Achashverosh's search for a new queen. But of course, there, the category is just most beautiful woman available. Here we see the opposite. An
original woman is chucked out, meaning it's not because she passed away and can no longer serve that role, but it's because of the whims of the royal life that he sends her away.
Exactly. So it highlights that what Avraham is searching for is somebody who can join the family, maybe already from the extended family, and continue his legacy by building the family with his son. And what's interesting is to see the ways that the Torah introduces this new character of Rivka. When Eved Avraham, who we often refer to as Eliezer, because that's how the Midrash identifies him, shows up at the busy time of water drawing and says, I'm going to do a test. I want to find somebody who acts with kindness, acts with chesed. And it's clear that he understands that that is a key feature of the family that he represents, the family of Avraham.
It's also interesting because, of course, the Midrash identifies Avram with the main character trait of chesed, but it's not necessarily, other than a tremendous chesed he does with Lot by risking his life to save him, it's not so clear where that comes through in all of the shot of the Torah, but we know that it's a main feature of the home because they're trying to find a woman who will mirror that same. I almost feel like they learn it back about Avraham,
yes,
the image of Rivka.
Because of this.
Yeah.
But it's not just that he says, I want somebody like this, and then, he happens to find Rivka. The text really wants us to see, already in the introduction of Rivka, parallels between her and Avraham, which of course is interesting because she's being recruited maybe as a Sara replacement. But the parallels with Avraham are very striking. One of the most obvious ones is that when Rivka is bringing water for the servant and for his camels, it says vatimaher vatar kadala shoket vataratz od el habe'er, that Rivka hurries, picks up her pitcher to the what's the thing called? Trough, the shoket, and then she runs to go refill the water. The verbs vatimaher vataratz, hurrying and running, appear in the same story, only with regards to two characters, Rivka and Avraham, when he welcomes the Malachim, that he runs and he hurries to welcome these people. Rivka is welcoming a stranger by doing this like intense amount of labor to help this person who she doesn't know, by giving him water and the camels, which we know is like an insane amount of labor because they can drink very large amounts of water. And the text is saying it's not just that she's a good person. We want you to already think, oh, this person might be a member of the family in the future.
Right. I guess I want to correct what I said before, because I think that what ends up happening in this idea of envisioning Avraham through the lens of Chesed is that we have that one main story of people coming to his house. And while it's not a theme that pervades every story of Avraham, it becomes like a paradigmatic story. And in this case, as you said so well, that Rivka's behavior mirrors that welcoming that Avraham does for them.
Right. She does this action out in the public square, and then the servant says, is there a chance that you have some room in your home? And just like Avraham, she doesn't just say, sure, you can come. She says, if you come, we'll feed your animals and we have a place for all of your people, right? She goes in this, emor ma'at va'aseh harbe, the I'm going to do more than expected of me. And we see that this is a familiar, a family theme, that they're willing to take people who they don't know and say, whatever we have, we're going to share with you. And often that guest turns out to be bringing important news.
So I just want to add in another place in Tanakh where we also have sort of an Avraham reference or an Avraham mirror, that in the book of Ruth, in the second chapter, in verse 11, Bet Yud Aleph, it says about Ruth, Boaz describes when he says, I've heard everything about you. It's when she meets him for the first time in the field. And he says, I've heard what you've done also. The word chesed appears very dominantly in the book of Ruth, which also sort of it throws us back to seeing Avram through the lens of chesed. He said, and I heard that after your husband died, v'ta'azvi avich v'imech ve'eretz moladetech, right? V'telchi el am asher lo yadat tmol shilshom. And this is a clear reference to the Lech Lecha command that Avram is given in the 12th chapter of Breishit, that you left your mother and your father's home, the land of your birthplace, and you have gone to the land that you did not know. Now, of course, in the story of Ruth, it's the opposite direction, meaning she leaves Moab and then comes back to Eretz Yisrael. It's not the same lands per se, but it's again this journeying through a loyalty to family. I feel with Avram we have the journeying. It actually requires him separating from his family, and in here we have a joining of a family and a journeying together. So there's also just an important piece there with Ruth, that this paradigm of the person, and here we're speaking about the person who does chesed, but in this case, it's the person who journeys, because Rivka will also have to journey away from her home to then go and join another home, that there's something about the mesirut nefesh of the journey in order to create family that also is something that seems to be a mark of the Avram family. Again, ironically, he has to separate from his father and his family, but he travels in order to create a new kind of family that is based on this new morality.
And interestingly, just like Ruth, but unlike most female characters in the Torah, Rivka has a certain amount of agency over the decisions that she makes, because later in the story, where they've said, theoretically, we're open to Rivka traveling back, but maybe she should stay, let's ask Rivka what she wants, which is so rare. They say, let's ask Rivka what she wants, and she says, I'm ready.
And then
let's
it's learned
go.
as a halachic precedent.
Yes,
that the woman must agree to her marriage proposal. Good idea. Have the woman agree.
Yes, highly recommend. But it means that when Rivka travels back, she is really doing something that Avraham did, in the generation before her. And she's saying, just like Avraham answered a call, I will answer a call, and I will make this move. And yes, she gets to join the family that's already there. She gets to go and meet someone who's waiting for her. By the way, interestingly, also maybe waiting in a place called Be'er. There's something very interesting about that next piece, which maybe we'll get to.
But Avram didn't get to answer, meaning He didn't.
Okay.
He didn't have the choice of agree or not agree.
I mean, he could have said no, and then there would be no Torah.
No, I agree with you. I'm just saying that what's particularly moving in the Rivka example is that she has agency, because most women don't, in specifically in the world of marriage at this time in history. And so she has agency there. What we often say is so remarkable about Abraham is that he has this complete obedience in that case. So it's just, I'm saying that I think the comparison is important, but I think there's also that significant difference between them.
So the question is then, right, is Rivka better, more remarkable than Abraham in some way? And the one way in which the Torah might be giving us an inkling of this is that we get the Rivka intro story, right? There's plenty to say in, Parshat Lech Lecha. Why don't we get a backstory about Abraham? The thing that's remarkable about Rivka is that from the moment she's introduced, we can tell that she's special. And one of my favorite, midrash that's really shot on this story is that the pasuk says that as soon as he sees her, Eved Avraham runs towards Rivka. Now, the Torah tells us that she's a part of the family. She's the daughter of Betuel, son of Nachor, so we already know she's going to be a character. But he doesn't know. Mm-hmm. So why does he run towards her? Rashi quotes the midrash in Breishit Rabbah that he saw a miracle, that she put her pitcher into the well and the water came up into her pitcher, and he saw this miracle and said, oh, this must be the girl, and runs towards her. But the midrash is giving one answer to the question of, why does he run towards her? And yeah, a miracle would certainly be a good reason. But there's this other piece, which is maybe she's just an outstanding human being, that when you look at her, you can tell that there's something special. Maybe she's, amongst all of these girls pushing through to draw water for their animals. And maybe she's acting with kindness. Maybe she's acting in a way that reminds him of Abraham and of Yitzchak, or maybe of Sara. Maybe there's something that he just sees that's not miraculous, but is miraculous in the way that you can identify a special human being, sometimes just on sight. I feel
like it's maybe she has very graceful body language or body movements. And there's something, right? We all know those people that we'll see them and we'll say there's just something so striking about them. And then when you're trying to analyze it, you could figure it out. And sometimes you'll discover that they were dancers when they're younger. And they're people that kind of just glide through life. And then whatever the example is, or someone has a particularly smooth way of speaking, or you see how they interact with the animals, and the animals just love them, and right, all those different kinds of markers, and they all come to answer this question, what did he identify in her? By the way, if I can go back to Ruth for a moment, the same question comes up with Ruth, because Boaz notices her in the field,
right?
And then all the commentators try to understand, what does he notice? And then you can go with simple things like, oh, well, she was dressed like a Moabite and she had a different way of dressing. There's also other examples where she wasn't dressed appropriately and therefore he noticed her that way. Or those that say, Rashi brings, she had a very tsanua way of being and it was more tsanua than others. Or this is same spectrum of saying, well, what can you notice about somebody from the outside? Can you notice something more than their physical attributes? I think all of us intuit the answer is yes. We can really feel somebody's energy very often.
Yeah. And as opposed to Avraham, who sort of jumps onto the scene because of his connection with God, right? Yeah. God knows that there's going to be a relationship between them. Rivka jumps onto the scene based on a connection with people, maybe a connection with animals, a connection with kind of existing in a larger society that she's not in conflict with, but she's willing to separate from, right? This is a woman, a young woman, maybe a girl, who's at home where she is, and yet she's willing to put all that aside and travel to the unknown for an opportunity to do something new, to connect to this sort of these distant relatives who maybe have found a path that's even more appealing than what she has at home.
I think you can also, dig into the midrashic ideas about her coming from a really unkind home and her wanting to sort of get out and get a new opportunity. That's one way to go about it. But I think that even if we don't try and reflect negatively about her own family, we do learn that she is a woman who's up for adventure. If anything else, she's up for adventure. Even when it's not clear, it's a pretty big risk to go with this servant, right? She doesn't really know much other than the story he's telling, which also could be not true in theory. And so, if anything,
she does get jewelry out of it.
I'm saying, if you want to
he
look at the
comes
story,
with money.
If you want to look at the story negatively, you could say, well, she's just being like, we know it's going to end well, but she, in theory, could be duped. But again, I think that if putting any kind of judgment aside, we do know that she is a woman who's up for an adventure and perhaps also a challenge, which will come in handy in her life as a matriarch.
Right. It doesn't go perfectly smoothly, but it does. The story does end nicely, right? She and Yitzchak seem to very quickly develop some kind of loving relationship, or at least that's what the text tells us.
So when we get to the end of chapter 24 of Perek Kaf Daled, so we have the last few psukim, which really speak about this first meeting between Rivka and Yitzchak. ויצא יצחק לסוח בשדה לפנות ערב, ויישא עיניו וירא, והנה גמלים באים. Yitzchak goes out to the field to, again, Chazal read that he's going out to daven, he's going out maybe on a little tiyul, whatever he's doing there in the evening. And he sees that there's this entourage is arriving. ותישא רבקה את עיניה, ותרא את יצחק, ותיפול מעל הגמל. She also lifts up her eyes. She notices this man. She falls off her camel. ותאמר אל העבד מן האיש, מי האיש הלזה ההולך בשדה לקראתנו? ויאמר העבד הוא אדוני, ותיקח הצעיף ותתכס. Okay, she realizes now, she asks the Eved, who is this man? He said, this is the man you're about to marry. And she immediately covers herself up, which was probably some sort of a gesture of respect. ויספר העבד ליצחק את כל הדברים אשר עשה, right? Everything is told to יצחק. ויביאה יצחק האוהלה, שרה אמו, ויקח את רבקה ותהי לו לאישה, ויאהביה וינחם יצחק אחרי אמו. So why don't we unpack that last pasuk, which again, just on a basic translation, is Yitzchak brings Rivka to the tent of his mother Sara. He marries her, right? Vayikach et Rivka, meaning he marries her, she becomes his wife. It says that he loves her, and then he is comforted after or in the wake of his mother's death.
So obviously, it's a little bit difficult to discuss the idea that, the loss of a mother could be filled by the love of a wife, because obviously these are two very different types of love. But it's clear that Yitzchak has been missing something, right? There's a hole in Yitzchak, which is filled when Rivka joins the family. And even, I'll just say, as you were reading it, I noticed, Eved Avraham is sent by Avraham, right? His mission was given by the father. But when he comes back, he reports to the son. Coincidence because they bump into each other? Or maybe this is the first step towards Yitzchak becoming, one of the avot, a main character in his own agent life.
Also.
Absolutely. And it turns out that what he needed was Rivka. In order to be able to do that, to step up, he's going to need to have a wife by his side. And from what we've seen so far, she seems like the best choice.
I also just want to say that regarding the death of Sarah, which we devoted last week's episode to Mamash in full, we know that Avram feels a lack because we have the description of his hesped, right? His eulogy for her, which is unique in our biblical landscape. But there's also something very meaningful about hearing retroactively that Yitzchak was extremely sad, right? That he felt that longing. It's a piece of information that we didn't get in real time. He's not present in that scene. And of course, we had all these questions about, where is Sarah in relation to the Akedah, right? Where is Yitzchak Bichlal emotionally in regarding that whole experience? And so there's something meaningful here to be like, oh, he missed her, right? She was lacking for him.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's interesting is that, we associate Sarah with her tent. Right, the Midrash associates, miracles that came because of Sara in her tent, and that restart when Rivka enters the family. But again, I just want to point out this interesting thing, which is that Rivka is not Sara. Rivka is introduced so totally differently than Sara, not as someone who follows, and with all due respect to Sara, who went with Avraham along all of his challenges. She never did those things alone in the text, right? She doesn't have her own path that she's following. And what Yitzchak is missing is not somebody who's exactly like his mother, but somebody who can bring her experiences from the outside world then into the tent and then share those from the more closed family unit that they can create together.
Right. I want to get back to that piece about the tent and Sarah's place in a moment, but I just wanted to mention something that I think definitely came up in past years, but I feel like we can never read these psukim and not bring up the idea, which is that the idea of imago therapy, or imago in general, is that we love people, fall in love with people who are sort of reflections, images of our primary caretakers. And based on what you said before, that Rivka is an Avraham figure, but that in the eyes of Yitzchak, what comforts him initially is not her Avraham-ness, but it's her Sara-ness, whatever that means within their dynamic, is very much the truth of this idea, that she somehow is a really a fusion of the Avraham and Sara figures. And I think that while he may not be sort of aware of the fact that her Avraham-ness is part of what makes her his perfect complement, it's her Sara-ness, which maybe it's just in the fact that she's a woman, and maybe it's because she's able to perform functions that were normally done by a woman, or maybe it's really because something in her body language or the way she holds herself that also reminds him of Sarah. But really that she seems to be, the text alludes literarily to the fact that she's like an Avraham and says outright that she's like a Sarah. So she really is a fusion of those two pieces. But I just wanted to go back to that, the ohel piece.
Yeah.
Because we know that in the places where Sarah is outspoken, it isn't just like I'm going to join in Abraham's mission. It's when she draws boundaries in her tent, right? When she draws boundaries between her and Hagar, when she's trying to draw boundaries between the two children. And it's in that space that she is in charge, right? And her voice is the one that has to be listened to. And there that she's the one leading the choices. And
if there was for one second anybody who thought I was, belittling Sara, whose, area of influence was her tent. No, that was her area of influence to the extent that God says, Klasher Tomar Hasara Shma B'Kola. Sara knows what's going on in the tent. Sara knows what the dynamics are between people and who's an influence who needs to be removed from this environment. Because if you're Avraham going out and interacting and being a man of the world, you might not have time or wisdom to focus on what's going on at home. And Sara has that wisdom, and Rivka has it in next week's Parsha. In case anybody doesn't know that Esav's the bad one, Yaakov's the good one, at least the way Rivka views it, right? She has that same wisdom of, I see my children, and I know what a mother needs to know about these people.
Yeah. In that case, though, she knows that her husband doesn't see it the same way she does, and therefore she goes about it in a different kind of way in order to have that truth be the one that persists throughout the generations.
Fair. Next week's podcast should talk about what's going on between Yitzchak and Rivka and that story.
So just to go back to this 10th piece, because I was thinking about two things that come up. The first is that in the past, Sarah is very sensitive to her space in the tent. And I imagine this feeling of, well, here comes Rivka, and she almost replaces Sarah. And we know that Sarah was very sensitive to feeling like she was replaced or being belittled in the past. And then I was thinking about that. Well, she's not alive anymore. And when it says Vayinachem that he's comforted, I was thinking about the fact that it's true in the face of loss or even in a non-negative scenario, people are replaceable. Okay. Now it doesn't mean that Sarah then gets erased, God forbid. But what it means is that when I say that she can be replaced, it's that her legacy as Sarah stays in its place with all of its glory. But for the needs of Yitzchak, her role can now be filled by somebody else. And so, and again, I don't know who's listening or how sensitive these topics are, but this comes up often, whether, someone passes away or somebody remarries, or even as a parent figure or a spousal figure. It's not that then that first person is no longer significant, but there are functions and love and different sort of like human resources that can be then continued through another person.
I wonder if that's why the order of the stories is how it is, which is that Yitzchak is comforted, and then it says that Avraham took another wife. You have to wonder if whether this is actually how it happened or just the way the Torah is laying it out, that Avraham maybe has sensitivity to,
and he was also, it also
Sarah.
said that he was old already. So the Parshanim even more so don't understand. We already were told that he's so old that he can't even go and find a wife. And so how is it possible that he then lives? He lives another 38 years and then has another 6 sons, and meaning it seems like he has a whole other chapter of his life. B'diuk, that's b'diuk the question. And we feel that he also was waiting for the right time when it's not replacing her in that same way, or at least when his son has been able to create a family structure, and then he can then also additionally create a family structure.
Yeah, absolutely. That he's not, throwing it in Yitzchak's face. He's acknowledging. I mean, we also wonder sort of about the relationship between Avraham and Yitzchak post Akedah, but the Torah here at least is winking at a sensitivity that Avraham has towards the mourning process that his son goes through, because obviously parents and children mourn loss differently. The loss of a spouse and the loss of a parent are both traumatic and ground shaking, but in different ways.
The other example that came to mind regarding a son in the tent of a mother is the negative story of Ruvain, and how Ruvain sort of wants to negate the possibility that Bilhah can take the place of his mother Leah, and then essentially has a sexual relationship with her to then invalidate her as a possible head wife after Rachel dies. It's a very different story than here, but it was another place where we have in Sefer Breishit the idea that the mother's tent is a big marker of a status shift. Right? In this case, it's a positive example of the fact that she now is able to attain the status of matriarch, right? And there's the Midrash, I believe, that says that the tent is actually for the first time erected again.
And that's the Ramban on this pasuk, that the tent was packed up and left, and then Yitzchak sort of announced we're pitching the tent again.
Yeah.
I'll also note that Yitzchak is the only one of the Avot to only have one wife.
Yep.
And there's something here also that's very solid about this relationship, that Yitzchak is very aware of the complications of having multiple wives. Interestingly, then he has twins, which creates a competition in the family. But I think this pasuk really gives a hope that Yitzchak's now going to have some stability in his life, something that he has not had, right? Okay, it doesn't exactly work out that way, but to a certain extent, you're happy for him.
Yes.
He dealt with the Akedah. He had a brother who maybe tried to kill him, who got sent away. All of these things that raised questions about literally him being able to continue as a human being, right? And at least now he has a person who's going to go through it with him. Again, his life continues to be complicated. None of the Avot have simple lives, but the idea that he has one person who's by his side through that journey, to me, that's menachem. That's comforting that you'll have someone to do it with.
Totally. And I think that is the major piece here, meaning there's a companionship, and then after they marry, it says vayaveh, and then it says that he's comforted. And I actually just wanted to address that word vayaveh, because I think often we get very excited that there is a word ahava when it comes to one of the patriarchs' relationship. Obviously, we know that Yaakov also experiences love for Rachel. But we get excited to see that word here, kind of makes us feel oh, well, this is a relationship that, it's not a partnership is great, but it's actually, they have a deep love for each other. And I just thought the commentary of Rav Hirsch here was both amusing and I think meaningful, that he basically goes on a very long tirade against the model of the secular romantic relationship, where you have to first fall in love.
First love, then marriage.
Then you marry. And he says, here you see that first they married because it was decided that they were suitable for one another, and only after they married do we then have the word vayaveh, because when you get to know somebody and you build a life together, over time you build up that love. And he sort of uses it as an educational piece of preaching to a generation that you should marry for suitability, and then you'll love each other.
Well, in the wise words of Golda from Fiddler on the Roof, right? She says, "Do I love him? For 25 years I've washed your clothes,"
Exactly.
Right? That's in some ways, right, the only true love comes from living a shared life. And to bring it back, having shared goals, right? Having a shared idea of where you're working towards, what you're trying to build your family towards. Yitzchak's born to Avraham with a very strong sense. Brit Milah at day 8, I know what I'm in for. And Rivka says, you know what? I'm willing to take the risk, as you said, join the adventure of joining the family of Avraham and working with Yitzchak to create that next generation.
Rachel, throughout this series, we're sort of looking at how what we admire, what we feel inspired by all of our different biblical heroes and superheroes in Sefer Breishit. And I guess I'm curious, after all of this conversation, what it is that you take most to heart about Rivka as a figure.
So I go back to this idea that we talked about a little earlier, which is that Rivka is noticeable as different, as special in some way. And I think about, what kind of message do we put out in the world when we walk through the world, I think about it a lot when we drive in traffic, how we like interact with people in like stressful hours of the morning. And I really think of Rivka in a traffic jam with sheep, which is more stressful than like when I'm in traffic trying to get to work in the morning. I have to imagine, right? The similar sounds of like loud noises and smells and stress. Yeah, it's exactly the same. And I just think like Rivka stood in a way that was identifiable, that she was like a bat shel Avraham Avinu, that she carries herself with chen, with grace, with kindness. And you discover it when you talk to her, and then you realize, wait, I knew that before. And I just think that something that is meaningful in my life is making sure that the way that I carry myself in the day-to-day, in the carpools, in the shopping, and all of those things, that I'm carrying myself also as somebody who could be identified ideally as a bat shel Avraham Avinu, a person who acts with kindness, who interacts with others in fair and appropriate ways, and goes above and beyond when possible. When, yeah, I'll let you, go in front of me because you only have 3 things to chat. Whatever it is, trying to emulate, Rivka was willing to do it for the camels. So where can I do that in my life? That's certainly something that I'm thinking about, and this conversation has just elevated all of the things about Rivka that I want to try to bring into my life. I know my name's Rachel, but I really identify with Rivka much more than Rachel, to be honest. I really feel like she's someone I can look to as like a woman who just carried herself with grace through life.
Wow. Okay, thank you for that, Rachel. Thank you for that idea. Halavai alenu.
Yes.
I'm thinking about how uncomposed I am in traffic situations. One of the main reasons why I just don't like driving places. But I appreciate that. And I really appreciate you coming on today for the episode to really think about, we really created like a portrait of Rivka, I think. I think also what I love about the figure of Rivka is that we have the most to work with.
Yes.
In terms of the things she did, and we have behaviors and descriptions, and also they're either neutral to positive, whereas with the other imahot we have very complex scenarios to work with. We of course have to contend with the communication or lack of communication between her and Yitzchak in next week's parsha, but in between we then have her she's also this first female figure who approaches God.
True.
Right? Who initiates a relationship with God. I think that's also unbelievably moving. It's part of this initiation, part of the initiative taking personality that we've seen from her. Is like, I'm having a problem. Something here isn't right. Let me go and lidrosh et Elohim, whatever that means, and figure out what's going on. And so I think that's also a very moving piece about Rivka. And because she's so used to, I think, taking initiative within the family structure, it leads to that kind of behavior that we see later vis-a-vis Yitzchak and the children.
Absolutely. Rivka doesn't wait for things to happen to her. She makes things happen.
Yeah. Thanks for being here, Rachel.
My pleasure as always.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode from Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. If you would like to sponsor an episode, please contact the Matan office or email me at podcast@matan.org.il. Please do us and all women's Torah learning a favor and share this episode with all of your friends and family.